I am a historian, but I dedicate most of the time since my graduation in Cuba to the environmental history. I study history at the university. When I end my career, I became an environmental historian due to another crisis, another big crisis in Cuba, that was the special period. And I think this special period is a reference for everybody to compare with the current situation. I found some similarities and other difference with the current situation in Cuba, but I think history is very relevant to understand the current situation. The long history of Cuba and the relation with the United States since the 19th century to the 20th century in general, a history of the anti-colonial fight against Spain after the relation with the United States, after the US occupation of Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century until the 1959 revolution, and the big shift in this relation between Cuba and the United States that represent the coming of the beginning of socialism in Cuba. And it's relevant for few reasons that I want to say now. I think Cuba was maybe the closest trade partner in the Americas, in the Caribbean in particular, with the United States. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the Cuban economy was very connected to the United States economy in many ways, in particular as a provider of the sugar cane to the US market. And this is why Cuba became the most dependent country from the United States from the 19th century to the 1959 revolution in many ways. For example, in food supplies. At the beginning of the revolution, 1958, the United States supplied most of the 26% of all the agricultural products going from the United States to the rest of the Latin America went to Cuba in that moment. And you can imagine comparing Cuba with Mexico, what that represents compared Cuba with the size of other countries in Latin America, as Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and others. And it's something to emphasize because sometimes in the discussion about Cuba, some people say that Cuba was self-sufficient in food before the 1959 revolution, but was not the case. Cuba depends so much of the importation of food from the United States since the 1959. In fact, in 1959, the first articles included in the blockade by the United States in the so-called embargo was lard, because Cuba was one of the biggest consumers of US lard since the 19th century. Well, there are different reasons about that, this complicated relation between Cuba and the United States. Cuba, after the independence war, became a kind of protectorate to the United States until the revolution of 1933, when the Platt Amendment was eliminated in that time. But Cuba remained in that kind of dependence from the United States until 1959 revolution. That was not only a political revolution against the Batista dictatorship, but was the social revolution. And something that I consider very important, the characteristic of an anti-imperialist revolution and anti-colonial revolution also in the context of the time, of course, the Cold War that influenced the path of the Cuban Revolution in that moment in many ways. And of course, from that moment began all that kind of sanctions policies from the United States that was called an embargo. But I usually say that an embargo from the United States is much more than embargo. It's a real blockade due to the history of the relation between Cuba and the United States. And of course, because the United States is the most powerful country around the globe, no? In our planet. And that made this not just an embargo against Cuba, but a real blockade, because the extraterritoriality of this policy. There is two moments. One moment until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, and a second moment after that time. And we can say that we are are two different countries in many ways. The country, the Cuban Revolution until the 1991, with many achievements, and in social terms mainly, and the second part of survival from the 1991 to the present. And I think that is very important. The current situation came from that long history, but also from what happened after the beginning of the first Trump government, after the Obama policies to in some way lift some of the embargo policies against Cuba. That was a moment of hope, a moment of potentialities in the new relation between Cuba and the United States. But that changed suddenly after the beginning of first Trump administration. From 2017, more or less in advance, I think that we can consider that the moment of the beginning of the moment of that crisis, with many of the sanctions that were implemented in that moment, and after the pandemic, that of course reinforced that situation, the damage that the sanction already did to Cuba, for example, to tourists. And the pandemic was a moment that really worsened the Cuban situation so much in many ways. Later came the Biden administration. The situation not changed so much. Just at the end, they take out Cuba from the list of so-called countries sponsor of terrorists. And then came the second administration that we are now in the first years. And of course, after the hostage of Maduro, after the situation in Venezuela from the beginning of this from January, the situation is really, really bad in many ways, affecting the daily life in many other ways. But it's not new because tourism was collapsing. The migration of Cubans were increasing in the last 2-3 years from the pandemic, or even before, and many other symptoms of this crisis. But of course, with the blockade to the oil shipments to Cuba, everything is becoming worse and worse. But when you compare with the special period, the situation is different also in some ways, no? Sometimes for the good and other for the bad. As a society, as for example, now I consider that the opportunities to have food from private business is more than in the previous situation in the 1990s. Maybe in that moment you can have money, but not shops, not a market to buy food and other necessities. But now there is that opportunity, and it's something that I think is important to take in consideration, because when people analyze the Cuban situation, everybody thinks that it's the same all the time in 60 years, and that's not the case. For example, during the special period, was really hard travel abroad from Cuba. You require a permission to travel, but that was not the case in the last crisis. That is one of the reasons why so many people can leave Cuba in the last year. And that's why I consider in some way that the Cuban today is more open than in the previous situation, in the previous crisis. Also, in terms of the energy, for example, one of the reasons about this crisis is the decentralization of the energy supply in Cuba. I don't remember very well the moment when this started, but Cuba tried to decentralize the electricity system through generators along the country. And that is one of the reasons of the current crisis, because we don't have oil for those generators. then we depend more from the big electricity providers, not electrotherm factories for the electricity. Also, of course, during the last years, the solar power is increasing, and under this crisis, much more, mainly with the support of China. Then when we arrived to this situation, it was good to have some more capacities for the solar power in Cuba that is helping more or less to ease the situation in terms of transportation. For example, in the last year, many people purchased electric motor bikes, electric cars, and also generators for homes. And that's something that is helping in this current situation in Cuba with the crisis. I usually, because I live in Cuba mainly, I don't have that sense of total collapse that the journals, the news present globally, the situation of the imminent collapse. I see in some way an adaptation of people for the daily life in different ways. In one way, it's more easy than others, depend where you live, depend of your income, depend of your situation. But I think that is something that we need to analyze more instead to all those news that talk only about an imminent collapse of everything. And I find people doing their work, most of the people, and I feel the sense of duty. I think more in the real people, real person that are doing their life every day. For example, as a historian, I go to the National Library. I receive the service from the National Library, even in this circumstance. And I think it's something important to emphasize. No, doctors are in the hospital, nurses, professors are at the school, and let's say that they receive very low salaries to do this, but I think most of the people or many people has the sense of a duty to maintain the service to the population. And I think it is something important. Also, of course, the government, but in general, how the people react to this crisis. People are waiting for a miracle from the sky. People are fighting every day against this awful circumstance that we are confronting and we are living. And I think this circumstance, of course, maybe you can blame to the government, but it's not the a consequence of a bad government in general. We can say in the same situation, any government, any genius can solve all the problems that we are confronting due first to the lack of oil, because any society today, unfortunately, can survive with the oil, fossil fuels in general. We have, let's say, a very limited dependence from fuel compared with many other countries around the globe, but still we need oil for a normal life, for electricity, for transportation, for many of the areas that are affected today. And talking about other consequences of this crisis, of course, as you mentioned now, the impact on tourists. And I have to say that we need to analyze Cuba not just as isolated country, but Cuba in our own region, Cuba in the middle of the Caribbean, the history of colonization, a history of dependence. And today, tourists represent in some way what was in the past the plantation economy, sugarcane that was also collapsing, that collapsed after the special period for many reasons. But what are the source of income to the Caribbean countries today? Are the income that are affected by those kind of policies that affect Cuba from the embargo or blockade policy from the US. remittances, for example. Most of the countries in our region depend on remittances, depend on services economy, tourists, and all those policies are trying to threaten that source of income. Tourists, for example, somebody mentioned here, an European who came to Cuba, later he can receive the waiver to travel to the United States, and you can imagine what represent. And I have to say how this affect the academic exchange between Cuba and other people, other colleagues, other countries, no? Because they have to decide, okay, or you go to Cuba, or you go to the United States. And it's a hard decision. And I know friends, colleagues that lost their waiver to go to the United States. In academic terms, also, we are confronting for years a lot of limitation, a limitation of sources, a limitation of the bibliography, the capacity to access databases, and of course, travel abroad, receive a grant to do our research, and to connect from Cuba through different platforms, for example, that are forbidden to Cuba. And this situation affect a lot the academic exchange of Cubans who are living in the island. And also something that is important, because in many of the discussion, in many of the media, it's not easy to find people who live in Cuba or people who have different soul, different way of thinking, to participate in those kind of discussions. And I appreciate this opportunity that you give me as a Cuban resident in Cuba, and I think that is more productive, because we can think, okay, that news are the truth, but generally are not the truth, are news that interview people who have the same kind of ideas about what happened in Cuba. And I think we need the media in general not present the different views, and especially the views from Cuba many times. Okay, I don't want to take more time talking about the present situation, but I think for different ways, people are aware what represent this blockade. But I think that we need to consider also the present situation globally, with the rise of new kind of ideas that are today defending a new kind of imperialism, a new kind of supremacists, and a new kind of white supremacy even. Many politicians talking about the Western society as the model for the rest of the world. Some kind of ideas that we thought that were disappearing years ago after the decolonization process, but we are very concerned about the rise of these kind of ideas and how affect us in our countries, in our former colonial countries. And I think this is why a forum like this is very important, to discuss openly what is happening with those kind of ideas today in many of the societies, that same ideas from the past, from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and it's something also to consider in the present Cuban situation, Of course, the solidarity, we have the solidarity of many people. We have the solidarity of many scientists, of many colleagues that try to help us to maintain our work in Cuba. My stay here is one of the samples. My stay at the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, for example, was an example of this, how people from different places try to help us to develop our different fields, different areas from Cuba. That is considered very important because Cuba, for years, developed the different the science in different fields, different areas, But this the science is damaged also because the current situation, and I think it's important to maintain that capacities, to maintain the possibility of people to work in the field of science in general. The collaboration of countries, for example, is in the China collaboration with the tremendous increase in the solar power. The use of solar powers is very important to overcome the present situation, but anyway, is not enough. And I hope, talking about the future, that is very important to build a new relation also with the United States, with people from the United States, with the partners in the United States. And the best way to support the Cuban science, the Cuban academy, and the Cuban people is maintain that ties to go to Cuba, visit Cuba, to defy all the restrictions and continue this relation that for sure will create the base for a new future also in the Cuba-US relation or in the Cuba-Europe relation. That is something very important for us. I'm always optimist of a new relation with the United States in the future. And let's see, it's a process to build from inside and from abroad, and the support of people that are concerning about the current situation in Cuba is very, very important. And okay, I think in any case, I think the most important is to maintain the sovereignty of the Cuban society, of the Cuban people. Because when you read the news, when you read or listen the debate or the discussion, is something that many times not matter what the people in Cuba think about, or perhaps part of the Cuban people, not all the Cuban people. But in any case, it's very important to maintain the sovereignty of our society, of our country. Is sometimes people say, okay, Cuban don't have the capacity for the self-government. And I think that's not the case in any way. And if the blockade of the embargo, let's say, not matter, if you want to blame the government, why not to lift the blockade policy? Why not to lift the embargo and to see what will happen with the Cuban situation? And I'm also optimist about the capacity among the Cuban for a mutual understanding, despite different ideas or different political opinion, but without interference of an external power that tried to manage or decide our future. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much for this very interesting and also very optimistic statements. I think this is extremely good and extremely helpful. I would propose that we now hear what Ulrike wants to say, and then hear what Armando will say, and then we start the discussion. Ulrike, I would give the floor to you now.
So, yeah, I have just prepared little slides. Okay. Okay, so let me start. Hannes, we're thanking you, of course, for your year-long engagement and all the time and the dynamics you put in the organization of this kind of exchange. That is extremely valuable, and all the Cuban scientists I have spoken with, they are very happy to know that there are this kind of places and spaces, and so Okay, before giving some observations from my point of view, which is, of course, someone from outside, but having lived there for 7 years in a very academic environment, I just wanted to tell you the background of my or the where I position myself, why I am interested in participating in this kind of event. So, as you have said, today I work at the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study. So again, in the academic international exchange. So that is a field I'm working in since 20 years. And so since 5 years here in Hamburg, and before I have been working in Cuba for 7 years, and I had the real privilege to discover the landscape of science and academy in Cuba. I was based in Havana at the DAAD office, a German Academic Exchange Office in Havana at the University of Havana. And I was also teaching at the Faculty of Languages at the University of Havana. So I got to know from the inside the Cuban academic and university system. I could travel a lot around the island and get to know many excellent and brilliant researchers, projects, exchanges also between Germany and Cuba, or German and Cuban researchers and professors and students and the whole ecosystem. So that was very impressive. And of course, that is something that today motivates me to also to testify that that was huge and that is huge. And I think things are broken down very quickly, and it takes years and years to build up this kind of things. So, of course, it hurts a lot to see what is going, what is breaking for the moment. So this is a very big motivation. Also, I have lived during many years the same difficulties that Reinaldo has just explained. So I have seen in practice the difficulties that scientists and scholars have in their academic exchange. And in theory, everybody knows it, but in practice, to know that in practice is really impressive. And to have cooperators, for example, who would like to cooperate, but they find no way to transfer money to the island to do a project. So professors and scientists from Germany, they have to travel with cash money in their luggage, and they have to do many things that under other conditions you would perhaps not do. So you really need to have a strong will to continue. And of course, from the Cuban side, even more difficult, because everything costs so much energy also. And over the years, you have suffered so much also, so many difficult situations that it's very, very hard to keep up the energy. And despite all that, the academic life is extremely rich and extremely also original, because many Cubans, they are kind of spurred by the idea that under these difficult conditions, they still develop very interesting ideas. So in a way, that has always been something that has inspired also Cuban researchers. And that is just very impressive to see from the outside. So in the end of my 7 years in Havana, we have started a petition with 5 people working in academia and in cultural mediation. Because we have been testifying these difficult conditions of academic and cultural exchange. And also, Hannes, you organized together with us an exchange in 2020, if I remember that right. And that was an outcome of the experience, of the year-long experience. And of course, you feel how unjust it is that a whole population or a society should be excluded from normal scientific, academic, and cultural exchange. So that was the idea behind the petition. On the slide, you see the Change.org address. If you still want to sign, it's always open. We'll come back to it later on. Yes, and then also my current workplace, Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, I realize every time more that the shrinking spaces in international academic and scientific exchange are so valuable, and that we really have to defend ourselves to keep these spaces open. And the difficulties, they become bigger and bigger. You have to argument many things you didn't have to argument before. Many of these activities become kind of a political activities, which was not necessarily the case before. So yeah, we feel very strongly that we have this privilege to have this kind of exchange platform, and we want to keep it open actively to all scientists from all the countries. And just a little remark, Reinaldo, having you at the Institute was not an act of solidarity. It is not an act of charity, but if we don't cooperate with excellent researchers from all over the world, then, I mean, what we are doing cannot be good and cannot be excellent and cannot have good results. So, yeah, we are more and more conscious about the fact that we have to defend this kind of places and spaces we do have. So, just some observations from my side. You have commented on that, Reinaldo, that the media tries to show an image of imminent collapse in Cuba. And I have the same experience as you say when I speak with my friends and my colleagues over there, and I ask them, how are you? And they always keep up high the morale, and they know that it is a strategy. They know that giving the island the fear of standing at the brink of collapse is a strategy of the United States, and being aware of that, they overcome it in a way which is really very, very impressive. And I think what the US administration tries to do with this total oil blockade that they have set up the end of January, they wanted to finally find the choking point of the US economy. And what we see, because it is nearly 3 months now that Cuba has received nearly no oil supply, is that there is still, I mean, of course, the situation is very, very difficult, but as I see it, they have reached to manage to run the country at, I don't know, 30% of the normal possibilities, and the collapse did not come. And I think it did not come because of the big resilience that Cuba has gained in the last decades, because, as you said also, Reinaldo, it's not new, it is just more extreme. But living with those terribly difficult conditions, there has been a long, long learning process. And I don't know if any other island would endure such a situation, or even bigger countries. So I think that is a direct effect of the learnings of the last decades, and the incredible Cuban resilience. Of course, the situation is catastrophic. I mean, we see and read about it every day, and that's true also. So in a way, it's good to stress that the whole picture is not only black and despair and so on, but on the other hand, we also have to avoid the effect that the outside thinks, finally they have found a way to endure and there's no problem. Of course, there's a huge problem. and also because the images in the media are not there, because if there is a hot war somewhere, you can show the pictures, the terrible pictures, and the world will look perhaps more closely. But a silent war, what is going on in Cuba for the moment, many people dying because they don't have the good medicine, they don't have the nutrition. But that is very difficult to show in the media. So that is, of course, something we have to talk about and explain that, okay, we cannot think that the things have stabilized. So, yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, you have all followed that in the media. There is negotiation. There are public interviews of the Cuban side. They have proposed or they have suggested measures to the US government as to economic reforms, or they suggest things to the US side which are not possible for the moment because the sanctions, they prohibit that. So this is a very clever thing, I think. So to negotiate in a way economic opening of the island by lifting the embargo step by step. Well, that is perhaps a dream. I think the interests are completely different, but yeah, for the moment there are these negotiations going on. So there will be development in the next weeks, definitely, and we can only really hope that it's for the good of the Cuban population, because the suffering is terrible. I think a reaction from the German government and from the European Union is needed. First of all, humanitarian aid. The German government has sent, for example, humanitarian aid after the hurricane in December, Melissa. It was 1,000 mattresses and 1,000 water filters, so there is room for improvement. But anyway, so I think that would be a good first step. And of course, Germany and also the European Union could unite with the United Nations, because they have condemned very strongly in February the oil blockade and the effects of the oil blockade, and they have condemned very strongly the attempt to intervene in the affairs of a sovereign state. So the UN official statements are there. Yeah, it would be nice if the German government and the European Union could align with that. I do completely agree, Reinaldo, that one important task is for the science community to keep going with the projects and with the exchanges that we have and that we do, and keep this space for scientific exchange open. I'm very glad that for the moment DAAD is still there. I mean, for the moment, the office in Havana is vacant, but I mean, the engagement of DAAD is still there. They have projects going on. Also, other funding institutions like DFG or Humboldt Foundation, they continue, and that is very important. Also, because there is, of course, a larger initiative, and I think there are many pressure groups, and they are very well funded also, long-term pressure groups that work, for example, on a European level as well. They try to demolish the image of Cuba in Europe or in the world, and they bring discussions about the Cuban missions of doctors and nurses, and they relate it to slave things. And again, there was another initiative that talked about Cubans in the war of Russia against Ukraine, and there was a fake news that the Cuban government had made a deal with Russia, which is completely, it is the strategy, not to damage the image of Cuba on several levels. and other topics as well. And for the moment in the European Parliament, there is an attempt to bring down an agreement that has been concluded between Cuba and the European Union. That was in 2016. That's the PDCA, Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement. That is the text that is still there for the moment on a European level. That is the basis for cooperation with Cuba in science, in culture, in green energy, I mean, different topics. And there is the attempt for the moment to cut this agreement. So that would be terrible as well. So I think many of those pressure groups, they come from many sides and do strong work. So I think it is super important to make this kind of events that Hannes is organizing today, engage in discussions. We will try to hand over the 120,000 signatures of our petition to representatives in the European Parliament to back them up in discussions on Cuba. So that is something we can try to do. And of course, it's a good idea also to donate. And that brings me to my last point. I have a video of Cuban physicist Arbelio Penton, and I can try to show it. Hannes, I hope it works. I will try to share the screen with you, and hopefully the sound, the audio is working. Let me try that. Because he is talking about a project that he is building up with colleagues from the University of Saarbrücken, and it is about bringing solar panels to Cuba, more specifically to, I think, the University of Havana, because Arbelio Penton was the dean of the physics faculty for many years, and they have installed a solar panel roof, yes, on the Faculty of Physics. And so the idea is to go ahead in this kind of project. So that is among physicists in Cuba and in Germany, and the panels will be bought in the nearest future and will be brought to Havana also in the nearest future, probably in April, in a container that we will organize. So if you feel inspired by that, and if you want to donate and you are looking for a specific project of physicists, that would be a very good occasion. So please let me know, Hannes, if you can hear. I'm afraid we can't. Can we?
Gratitude for the
Oh,
opportunity.
it works.
It works?
Yes. Maybe if you can put it a bit louder, would be
Yes.
easier.
Yeah. A second. My computer that doesn't work. Yes.
I would like to thank my gratitude.
Is that okay, Hannes?
Yeah, it was okay when you were running it. Now it stopped. But...
Okay. That's all that I wanted to hear. Then here we go.
I would like to thank my gratitude for the opportunity to participate in this seminar organized by Scinece4Peace, and of course to also Ulrike for keeping me informed about this meeting. Well, this meeting is very important due to the critical situation we are facing in Cuba as a result of the aggressive policy of the USA government. And well, in this context, education and scientific research are very hard affected basically due to the lack of electricity and transportation. From our universities, we refuse to abandon our teaching missions. We want to keep our computers, laboratory equipment, and telephones operational so that we can maintain communication with our students. One of our missions as professor and researcher is to promote and coordinate actions that allow us to maintain teaching and research at our higher education institution at a respectable level under this condition. In a very complex global geopolitical context expressed through nearly 60 conflicts and the involvement of 78 countries, I believe that scientific diplomacy must play a crucial role with a single goal: to maintain peace through education and science in order to contribute to the resolution of political conflicts. In this context, the history of scientific relation between the USA and Cuba has endured through the years despite political conflicts. Collaboration in the field of health and environment demonstrate this. Scientific diplomacy is an effective means of communication when political channels are closed. Therefore, within the framework of scientific diplomacy, we can organize action to mitigate the effect of the USA policy against Cuba. And I would like to share some proposals and mention others that are already underway. As first action, I suggest to contact our colleagues in the United States and inform them of the negative effect of this policy on our education system and science in Cuba. We can, or we could or should organize action to mitigate these effects. I would like just to mention two examples. The Association for Academic Cooperation Cuba-France is launching a fundraising appeal to support the purchase and delivery of photovoltaic equipment to Cuban research laboratories in the exact science and humanity at the University of Havana. This is actually an ongoing action. This equipment will consist of integrated electric generator station providing between 1 and 4 kilowatts of power for a minimum of 3 hours to power office equipment, computer servers, or laboratory equipment and instruments. We have begun organizing a similar initiative with the Saarland University in Saarbrücken, and I invite our German colleagues who wish to join this initiative to do so. If you want to have more information about this activity, you can contact me directly, and Ulrike has my coordinates. I believe this kind of action are possible. I'm sure we can find other avenues and type of support or cooperation. It is important that science play a significant role in addressing new economic and political challenges. I believe this is a unique opportunity to demonstrate that a better world is possible. I really thank you all for this opportunity.
Okay, Hannes, so that's all from my side.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ulrike, for this information. I guess we should exchange some contacts how to contribute to this initiative, which I think is excellent. Okay. I would now give the floor to Armando to say a few words, and then we can start the discussion. Armando, the floor is yours.
Hi, Hannes. Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and for the interest on everything that is happening in Cuba. So I'm not in Havana, so I'm in Hamburg. But of course, I have family there, and my heart is completely there, even though I'm here. And I just wanted to go back to something that Ulrike was mentioning, that if one doesn't know if another island or country could resist something like this, I like to look at an example in history of the country in which I am right now. That of course is not statistically significant, but it gives some feeling of how things could go for another country, and that is after the First World War, and because of the imposition of reparations on Germany, and because of the taking of the Ruhr area by the Allies, namely France, for imposing reparations, the German society and economy collapsed, and this led to the 1923 hyperinflation that we all know what led to in the years that followed. So, and that was Germany, which was, if not was one of the biggest, if not the biggest industrial power of that time. And industrial power that was not damaged during the First World War, because the war did not happen in the German territory for the most part. But okay, so if something like that can happen to Germany, what can happen to an island that is 90 miles away from the biggest, most powerful country that ever existed? Yeah. So on the other hand, I agree with the statements by Ulrike and the ideas, and actually, I agree that the science must be supported and in this situation. But I think science normally occurs at daytime. And for the rest of the population, I think, for example, this strategy of the solar panels, which I find the most important alternative, I think would have a larger impact if one would prioritize a larger population. And that is because Cuba, of course, generates, I think it's a little less than 20% at the moment from solar energy, but this is only in daytime, of course. And then the peak of demand is it's on afternoon, evening, and there's nothing that this solar fields can do about it. And actually, it might even destabilize electrical system. So I think if the larger population would be able to acquire solar panels, that could ease the load on the grid in the afternoons and evenings. And then this is why I was not right now. It's in a private way, but I'm starting to buy some solar panels and trying to see how if I can go every once in a while to Cuba and give them to the community neighbors or things such that this can be used. And also, it's a bit more difficult with the batteries, but this can, I think, can be done. And the irony is, and this is the story that I think shows how tricky this relation between the US and Cuba is that there are companies that one can order, and they are based in the US, that one can order batteries such that they can bring them to Cuba, of course, at a much larger price. So of course, you blockade an island, you impose a choking oil blockade, and then you allowed your companies in the south of so in the south of Florida from Miami to deliver, batteries to the island at overprice. So this is beyond any I don't know, decency. Let's put it as for lack of a better word. but there are these companies that can deliver this big batteries. For example, for my family, they have one at the moment, and it's like, I think 2,000 watt hour, and it is, and for the fridge, and it's quite a, I don't know, medium to low consumption refrigerator. It lasts, I guess, around 7 to 8 hours, but that during the night, it covers if there's a blackout on things, and to wait until daylight, such that the battery can be recharged with a potential eventual solar panel. So, and I think if I mean, the situation is very, very critical, but it might. Of course, here I'm biased and I have a lot of wishful thinking, but it might even improve things in the long run in some way, like to really transform the energetic foundations of the island. So, like to use up what we have, which is sun, the natural resource that we have, and if that could be combined with the private use of solar panels, that could lower the load on the electrical grid. And as well, if there's a push by the government or companies or enterprises to manage the transfer of excess energy from homes to the electrical grid, which I don't see happening. I think there's some hospitals and state-owned companies in which it happens, but I don't think it's happening for the wider population. But Professor Reinaldo can correct me if I'm wrong. So that would help a lot. So yeah. Some other points, but now I'm forgetting about them. So I think this is mostly what I wanted to say. I mean, if you have any suggestion or question or remark, please don't hesitate to communicate it.
Thanks a lot, Armando. Then this was also very interesting and very important to hear on possibilities on solar energy also for the private sector. Thanks a lot for everybody, Reinaldo, Ulrike, and Armando for your contribution. I will now stop the recording and then we can start the discussion.